So today is February 4th. Welcome back. And but we did finish most of what we wanted to. We did turn in our dissertation proposals, and I got mine back. Did you get yours back? I think I got mine back.
Well, I looked at it and I could not see a grade or any comments.
Yeah.
So
Something came back, so it's been acknowledged. I haven't gotten an expulsion notice from the school, so that's a good thing. So we're welcome to. This is Silas. This is our son here, and Victoria. I'm Stan. So glad to have you here today. We're in 1 Corinthians. I usually start talking about things that happened on this date, just because I like to. So it was on this date, February 4th, 1194, that King Richard the was ransomed for 100,000 English pounds at the time. Now, what that's worth today, I have no idea. But Richard Richard the Lionhearted, was ransomed, and he was not ransomed a minute too soon, if you know the story. Because what was going on in England? Does anybody know what was going on in England at that time? I'll tell you, the evil Sheriff of Nottingham was taking over things, and were it not for Robin Hood keeping the flame alive for good King Richard, that's what was going on. The story of Robin Hood is set during the time that King Richard was being held for ransom. And this was also part of the First Crusade, or one of the Crusades, which is a whole nother highlight of Christian history, and I use the word highlight loosely. It was on this date in 1555 that English reformer John Rogers was burned at the stake in England. He was the first martyr under the reign of Mary, aka Bloody Mary. We talked about her last week. Now, Rogers was the guy. One of his main claim to fame was he was a printer. And in this time period, in the 16th and 17th century, to be a printer meant more than simply owning a machine, although that was an integral part of it. To be a printer also meant you were an editor and a publisher, and very often a writer. One of the reasons why Ben Franklin was as influential as he was not because he simply owned a printing press, which he did. He was a writer, editor, publisher. And he actually was instrumental in printing what's called the Matthew Bible, which is a Bible that he put together in English in 1537, using some of Tyndale's. And so this was one of the early Bibles printed in English in England. And that didn't go over well at the time. Tyndale was killed, and then ultimately John Rogers, who used the pseudonym Thomas Matthew to print the Bible, and so when you talk about the Bible, it's called the Matthew Bible. He was killed on this date in 1555. In 1789, the Electoral College chose George Washington to be unanimously voted George Washington to be the president of these United States. The only time that the Electoral College has voted unanimously, there was one generation or so later, I think it was James Monroe. It would have been a unanimous vote for Monroe, but one elector voted for someone else because he said only Washington deserves to be unanimous. And it's never been unanimous since. It's been close. But it's never been unanimous since. In 1846, the Mormons left Nauvoo, Illinois. Has anybody been to Nauvoo in Illinois? I've been there. It's an interesting. Remember, the Mormon church started in New York and then moved to Missouri, and then they moved back to Nauvoo. And then after Nauvoo, they were kicked out after the death of Joseph Smith, and they went to Utah. Went to Utah and stayed there, and that's where the Mormon Church is headquartered. There's still a large presence. There's still a large there's still a large Mormon presence in Nauvoo. It's actually, I don't know what you want to. It's a historical site. They own, I believe that they own the prison where Joseph Smith was killed, and there's a big temple there. And it's kind of we went there, Debbie and I went there many years ago, early 90s we went there. And it was one of those interesting moments where I thought, oh yeah, cool, let's go see where Joseph Smith was killed. And it was just, great fun for me. And there were people there, as I recall, that were like crying that they were there. This is where the prophet was killed. Wow, So it's kind of a lesson in cultural sensitivity for me. I don't know that I've learned it, but that's where the lesson was given. But that happened on this date in 1846. In 1859, one of my favorite characters in Bible literature, Count von Tischendorf. I don't know, I just like that name. If we had had a third son, we were going to name the third one Tischendorf, after Count von Tischendorf. Count von Tischendorf discovered the Sinaiticus document in a monastery in Sinai. Now, the Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus, is one of the earliest editions of the Bible, complete Greek translations of the New Testament. And as a result of that and several other things, developed the science, we call it, of textual criticism. And that involves where you've got, where you have, you had this text, and they looked at this text, and they said, wow, this text, clearly based on the way it was written and the way the words and the paper and all of that, this text is older, this physical text is much older than any text that we'd had prior to that point. And so they started looking at it, and they said, well, let's look and see what is different. So they started looking at this Sinaiticus document, and they realized, hey, wait a minute, there are verses in these later documents that are not in this earlier document. What happened? Why are there verses in this document, this later document? Like, I can't remember the name of it. Alexandrius, I think, is one of the other major codexes. But there are other manuscripts where there are other verses, there are other words and things added to these later documents. Why is that? And so they started, and so throughout the end of the 19th, going into the 20th century, you had the rise of this idea called textual criticism, where people started thinking, okay, well, what happened? Why are there verses stuck in there? And people started realizing, hey, wait a minute, the process of Bible transmission, of textual transmission, was not as neat and clean as we maybe had thought it was. That there were people along the line who were like adding things or adding commentaries, and then the commentary became so good that somebody who was copying it thought, let's just include that in the text, kind of thing. So you'll hear stories sometimes when people talk about Bible transmission or textual transmission about people copying, how carefully they copied the text. That's the Old Testament. Okay, when they're talking about that, they very carefully, the Hebrew Jewish scribes would very carefully copy the Old Testament text. New Testament, not so much. New Testament was just sort of like copy it as quickly as they could get it out there. So sometimes you come up with these textual ideas where people go, wait a minute, what about this verse? What about that verse? And so if you have a modern translation of the Bible, two big examples is if you look at the book of Mark, at the end of Mark, your Bible will say something like, the best manuscripts don't include this last ending of Mark. Okay, and then there's a story in John, there's a woman taken in adultery, I think, John 7, the end of John chapter 7, they'll say it'll be blocked off, and they'll say the best manuscripts don't include that. And there's all kinds of examples of that in the Bible, and every once in a while, if you follow some of the interesting people on Instagram that I do, every once in a while you'll see somebody go, they took verses out of the Bible. It's like, well, yeah, actually they added verses, and they're just kind of but that was on this date in 1859 that Sinaiticus was discovered. In 1924, the first Winter Olympics opened, 100 years ago. Do we have any Winter Olympics this year? Does anybody know? Is it this year? Yes, we're having the Winter Olympics this year. Opened in France. 100 years ago today. 50 years ago today, Patty Hearst was kidnapped. Does anybody remember Patty Hearst? It's on this date in 1974 that Patty Hearst was kidnapped. She's still with us. She's only like 70, something like that. She was like 19 when she was kidnapped. She was in the clutches of the Symbionese Liberation Army for about a year and a half. She was finally released, arrested, went to jail. Her sentence was commuted by President Clinton, I believe, and then she was pardoned by Obama. I believe that's how it went. She was commuted by one president and pardoned by another. It might have been Bush. I don't remember who pardoned her.
Wasn't the story that she was captive and then she participated
Yeah.
was it a bank robbery
Yes.
or something?
Oh yeah, there's no question she participated in the bank robbery. And but her argument, you know, and they've got her on film. There she is on the film holding. There's a very famous picture of her holding a gun. And one of her arguments was that the gun had no bullets. She was given the gun and the gun had no bullets. She was just told that she had to be there, kind of thing. But she was, you know, you had the what they call the Stockholm syndrome and brainwashing and all kinds of interesting things. But she is with us. She has been, I believe she wrote a book about it. She's been in a couple of movies. She's been in a couple of documentaries. She goes by Patricia Shaw is her name now. She doesn't call her. So she's a granddaughter of the Hearst family. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate. So, but that was in 1974. In other travesties, and this may not mean if you're not a baseball fan, it was on this date in 1991 that Pete Rose was banned from baseball. Okay, so to me this is one of the tragedies of life. I am a pro Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame guy. I'm like, put him in the Hall of Fame. Come on, this is just hypocrisy, you know. I mean, baseball makes a huge amount of money off of DraftKings and betting on baseball now, and to sit there and say, well, we can't have Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame. You know, I mean, the guy is around. He's like 85 years old. I'm like, you know, put the guy in the Hall of Fame. Get it over with. He's like one of the greatest players ever. Everybody, you know, you look at any record, he's up there. You know, but be that as it may. All right, I'll get off my soapbox now. And finally, a couple of birthdays. Today is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's birthday. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, born on this date in 1906, he wrote the book The Cost of Discipleship, which is a really good book. Also, he wrote a book called Life Together, which is kind of a reflection on the Sermon on the Mount, if you're interested in that. He was killed just a few weeks. He was arrested. He was part of the group. You know, there was an assassination attempt on Hitler during World War II. Bonhoeffer was German, and there was an assassination attempt, and there were a group of people that were part of the plot to kill Hitler, and this group of individuals that were in on the plot were all part of a bigger group. And Bonhoeffer was part of that bigger group as well, people that were opposed Hitler. And I don't know how formal it was, but it was formal enough that, so he was part of that larger group, and the subgroup of that group was the one that tried to kill Hitler. I don't think Bonhoeffer was anywhere near the decisions or knew anything about that. But he was caught up in that, and then before the end, they wanted to get rid of anyone remotely related to that group, and so he was hung. And finally, today is Rosa Parks' birthday. Rosa Parks was born on this date in 1913. Who there's a in Cincinnati, there's the Underground Railroad Museum. The National Underground Railroad Museum. Now, it doesn't necessarily have anything directly to do with the Underground Railroad, but we went there, and they have they have a virtual reality sort of experience where you can sit and, they've recreated the scene on the bus in Memphis, no, Selma, Alabama, I forget where. Some,
Or was
Montgomery, 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 where it recreates the scene where you're like put the thing on, and then you are Rosa Parks sitting on the bus, and the person comes up to you and says, "Get off the bus," or all of that. So it's kind of interesting there. So, all right, that's it. That's it. All right, I know. Is he ever going to get to 1 Corinthians? I guess I have a lot of stuff to talk about on. Okay, we are in 1 Corinthians 14. And 1 Corinthians 14 is really a pretty simple, to me, it's a pretty simple passage. It's a pretty simple section. Again, remember we're talking about, we're continuing Paul's discussion of problems in worship. That's your first dot there. You're, continuing Paul's discussion of problems in worship. These are, the church has written him a letter, and he's responding to the letter, and he's responding to various problems that the church is having. And we talked about head coverings, and then we talked about spiritual gifts, and we talked about love. And as a result, Paul has established 2 criteria for manifestations of the Spirit in worship. It's like, how do you know it's a manifestation of the Spirit in worship? He says, well, there's 2 ways to know. One of them is it was done for the common good. It was done for the common good. And number 2, it was done in love. It was done in love. And we'll see as we talk today that clearly the way that the church is utilizing tongues in, as Paul describes it, is not something done, is not benefiting the common good. Okay? So these 2 are principles we're driving in, and we start in verse 14, in chapter 14, beginning with verse 1. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. Okay? He says to follow the way of love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts. Now, I think it's interesting. And you see I've got a little arrow drawn in there to a passage in Acts chapter 19. I don't know if Paul is doing a play on words here or not. Maybe he is. But when they talked about it at this time period, they weren't called Christians. Followers of Jesus were not called Christians. Okay, they were not, and they certainly weren't called Baptists or Presbyterians or whatever. I mean, they were called followers of the way. That was what they were called. And there's a couple of references, in Acts 19 is one of them, where it says, there arose a small disturbance from the followers of the way. So I suspect Paul, I wonder if Paul is kind of doing, follow the way of love. Say, what is a characteristic of the way? It's love. Okay? And eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. Okay? Especially you all should, and this is members of the church, should desire the gift of prophecy. Okay? Now, I'm going to jump ahead here to kind of just explain the big picture of this passage. Now, here he talks about, when we talk about prophecy, we talk about the gift of prophecy, we always kind of go, are we giving a message from God? Are we telling this is what thus saith the Lord, this is what's going to happen, Babylon's going to be destroyed? Or are we just giving a message, the forthtelling versus foretelling? Paul doesn't make that distinction. The distinction Paul is going to be making throughout this passage, because he's going to compare prophecy versus tongues. And these are 2 spiritual gifts that are being manifested in the church. And his question is not necessarily you need to be able to tell the future, you need to have a direct word from the Lord. The question is intelligibility. Okay? Paul, he says prophecy because people understand prophecy, people don't understand tongues. Okay? So basically the message, maybe I should wait till the end to tell you this, but the message of Acts chapter 14 is that don't exercise tongues because people don't understand it. Exercise prophecy because people understand it. That's the bottom line of Acts chapter 14. Okay? Now I'm going to go back through and painfully work through every single step till we see that. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm not. So, first of all, we need to understand that in the New Testament, when we talk about tongues, there are two manifestations of tongues, or two ways that tongues are used. And I'm not going to get into the Greek, the glossolalia, or any of that stuff, but just say that if you just read through the text, you'll find there are two ways that tongues are discussed. First of all, there are tongues as in Acts chapter 2, Pentecost. Okay, Acts chapter 2, that they were able to speak a foreign language, and a person who is so I could speak Swahili, and miraculously speak Swahili, and somebody who is in the audience who doesn't speak English but does understand Swahili would understand my message, and then he or she would accept the Lord, as what happened at Pentecost. In fact, the pastor that I grew up with very firmly held to that idea that that's what tongues are, and that in order for tongues to happen, you had to have unsaved Jews in the room who did not understand the language you spoke. And he said, in those circumstances, tongues could still happen. Okay, so you had to have unsaved Jews who didn't understand English, okay? But that's one way tongues is looked at. The other way tongues is looked at is as in different ways, a heavenly language, a use of a language that is incomprehensible to anyone, okay? A private language of some sort, okay? So, and it's clear, and we're talking about it here in 1 Corinthians 14, but in other passages, Paul talks that at this time in the first century church, that those were the two ways that tongues were manifested, okay? Now, so one, Acts chapter 2, the gospel to non-believers, and here in 1 Corinthians 14, kind of a spiritual, private, inner language, private language between you and God. Okay, so these are the two ways that tongues are commonly used. Okay, and the problem here in Corinth, in the church of Corinth, is they're focusing on that second use of tongues in public. And so people are standing up in public, and they are saying that they're praying in a language that's not understood. Okay, and again, I don't have a lot of experience being in this environment. Maybe some of you do, but people would stand up and say, "I'm going to pray," and then they would start praying, and they would start praying in a different language or using words, sounds that were clearly not whatever the language is that the people would do. Okay, and so that's Paul's problem, is that doing this in church when no one else can understand what you're saying. Okay, Paul's got an issue with that. Paul's issue is that without interpretation, that is to say, translation, the church is not built up. The church is not built up. Okay? And I say here, if you see I got the little box here up above, build up equals edify. The word edify is used. Let me read some of the text here, since I've gotten ahead just filling out the thing. Follow the way of love. This is 1 Corinthians 14. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people but to God. Okay, there's that heavenly language. So he's clearly talking about this heavenly, I'm calling it a heavenly language. People call it different things. Okay, that's just the word I'm using. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. Now, the other interesting thing about this, and I think I'm actually going to get to it later on, Paul never denies that this is a gift of the Spirit. Okay, Paul never says, oh, this isn't happening, or this is wrong, or you guys are deluded. Okay, he never says that. Okay, quite the opposite, in fact. Okay, so his point is not that you're speaking in tongues. His point is where you're doing it, and I think that's a question somewhere down the line on the handout. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouragement, and comfort. So Paul's issue is that without interpretation, that is translation, the church is not built up. Prophecy, on the other hand, strengthens, encourages, and comforts. So when somebody stands up and prophesies, because prophesying, either forthtelling or foretelling, is in the language of the people. It would not do me well to give a lesson, to do this entire lesson in Swahili. Does anybody speak Swahili in the room? Just want to check, because nobody would understand it. And I could be saying the absolute truth, and you wouldn't understand it. I mean, how many of you have ever been in like a service or something where somebody is speaking in a foreign language, where the preacher is preaching in a foreign language. You ever had that experience? Yeah, I've had that several different times where you're in a service, like, we went to one in Haiti where the whole thing was in Creole. I guess it was Creole, right? And you just kind of, you're just there, sort of thing. And we went to. I remember when Debbie grew up in a Spanish church, so when Debbie talks about sitting in a Spanish service, it doesn't count because she understands. So that's.
I did for many years though.
But
When I was younger.
we went to her. The Spanish church that she had grown up with, and her dad was instrumental in, and all had a wedding shower for us when we were getting married, and I was a little hesitant to go because I'm like, I don't speak Spanish. And she says, she told me, don't worry, they speak English around me. They only speak English around me. Okay, that was a lie. They didn't. They didn't say a single word of English. Until the very end, one of the women in the church managed to discover the way in English to tell me, if you hurt her, we'll kill you. They managed to say that in English, but everything else was in Spanish, kind of thing. So. But yeah, you're like, okay, I'm here, it's great, but you're not really getting anything out of it. Pardon me?
Showing you love.
Right, showing me love, and I'm still here, so apparently I have not hurt her, not that I wanted to at all. So, but be that as it may, so. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves, but the one who prophesies edifies the church. Now remember, what are the characteristics of a manifestation? What are the proper manifestations or the guidelines? There's two. It's got to be done in love. It's got to be done for the common good. So if you're doing something that edifies yourself, now again, he's not denying that it edifies, that it builds up yourself. Okay? He's only saying it's not building up anyone else. And so in terms of problems in worship, things you do in the common good, you should not be speaking in a language that nobody else understands, because all you're doing is confusing everyone. Okay? I would like every one of you to speak in tongues. Okay, so again, he's like, I'm fine with you speaking in tongues. I don't have anything against speaking in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets so that the church may be edified. Okay, so here at this first portion, Paul is very clear. It's like, okay, if you're just speaking in tongues and you're just edifying yourself, you are edifying yourself, but you're not edifying the body. And the only exception, now he gives this exception, says unless someone interprets, so that the church may be. So if you stand up to say something, you have to know that there's going to be somebody there that's going to interpret what you say. Now, brothers and sisters, now he gives this personal example, verse 6. Now, brothers and sisters, if I come to you and speak in tongues, what good will I be to you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or word of instruction? Even in the case of lifeless things that make sound, such as the pipe or harp, how will anyone know what tune is being played unless there is a distinction in the notes? Okay, so it's kind of interesting, if you ever see the idea of sitting around and saying, okay, we're going to go to a concert, and the concert is we're all going to just stare at a piano. People are like, okay, is anybody going to play the piano? No, I'm going to ignore. Is it John Glass who did John Glass? You would know John Glass who did the 9-minute silence or something like that. Kind of. Pardon me?
4 minutes, 33 seconds.
4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. So but it's like no. I mean, the point is you gotta play something for it to be, for it to make sense, or for it to be enjoyable or edifying. Okay. Again, if the trumpet does not sound a clear call, who will get ready for battle? Okay, so again, there's certain trumpet, we would consider like a bugle message that, you play this and that means charge, you mean this means retreat, this means, all we know now is reveille and taps. But again, there was a whole series of these bugle calls that people heard them in the army, and they would know, okay, that means this, that means that, kind of thing. And if you mess it up, some people can say, was that reveille or was that attack? I don't know. So it is with you. Unless you speak intelligible words with your tongue, how will anyone know what you're saying? You will just be speaking into the air. Undoubtedly, there are all sorts of languages in the world, yet none of them is without meaning to people who understand them. If then I do not grasp the meaning of what someone is saying, I am a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker is a foreigner to me. So it is with you. Since you are eager for gifts of the Spirit, try to excel in those that build up the church. That is the common good. Okay, so again, so apparently what's going on in Corinth, and again, Corinth, he's relating to what's going on in Corinth. So one of the issues in Corinth is that you've got people standing up and speaking in tongues and nobody's interpreting it. Okay? And Paul's like, stop that. Speak in tongues, that's fine. Go home, speak in tongues, that's great. Okay, now again, realize that the Corinthians had this over-realized eschatology. They had this idea that we've reached it, we've arrived. And Paul's saying, no, you haven't. You're not building up the body, you're not building up the church. Cut that out, okay? Stop that, okay? For this reason, the one who speaks in a tongue, I'm in verse 13, for this reason, the one who speaks in a tongue should pray that they may interpret and that they may interpret what they say. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. Now that's a tricky phrase. We don't what is Paul talking? The spirit is moving, but the mind is unfruitful. Okay, it's an unclear. Is it something that the spirit is manifesting without any part of the mind? It could be a lot of different things. I don't know, so I'm just going to I'm going to have to skip that point here. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. Verse 15. So what shall I do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my understanding. I will sing with my spirit, but I will also sing with my understanding. So I guess the suggestion here is that Paul is saying, sometimes when people are praying in tongues or speaking in tongues in the church, they don't even know what they're saying. And he's saying, what's the point of that if you don't even know what you're saying? What is it? Otherwise, when you are praising God in the Spirit, how can someone else who is now put in the position of an inquirer say amen to your thanksgiving, since they don't know what you are saying? You're giving thanks well enough, but no one else is edified. So Paul's issue is not the speaking in tongues. Paul's issue is that it's not edifying the rest. It's not edifying the body. So if you're doing things that are building yourself up, edifying yourself, but you're not building up the body, what's the point? Okay? So if you're not building up the body, what's the point of doing it? Okay? You are giving thanks well enough. Verse 18, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. So lest the Corinthian readers think, wait a minute, Paul's just mad because we're speaking in tongues and he's not. Paul's like, wait, no, we kind of have this little glimpse into Paul's spiritual life. It's like, hey, listen, I'm all for speaking in tongues. I do it more than any of you. More than any of you, I'm all about this speaking in tongues. Okay? But in the church, I would rather speak 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. Okay? So Paul indicates, let's see, where am I? The bottom line implication from verse 12 is that tongues don't build up the body. Verse 13 through 17 indicates that tongues builds up the individual but not the body. Paul asserts that he speaks in tongues more than any of the Corinthians, and Paul would rather speak 5 intelligible words than 10,000 that are not. I think the others, I said it earlier, earlier up there, Paul's concern is not whether one speaks in tongues, but where, and perhaps when. You could do where or when. Okay. Verse 20. Brothers and sisters, stop thinking like children. In regard to evil, be infants, but in your thinking, be adults. In the law, it is written, just think about that. In what way is this childish? So in what way is the members of the church speaking in tongues in this way childish? Anyone?
Well, they're doing it for themselves.
Yeah, it's all about me.
Church.
Me, 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 me. I mean, you ever try to reason, with a 3-year-old? It's to me, I've discovered again. I'm done with my ninth grade thing. I ended that this week. Reasoning with a 3-year-old, reasoning with a ninth grader, not a whole lot of difference. That's my opinion. I don't. There are others who differ. But it's like, talk to the wall. Talking to the wall is more pleasant than talking to some of the ninth graders that I dealt with. But regardless, it's all about me. Me, 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 me. I'm going to do this in the middle of the church because, okay, Paul's like, hey, let's cut that out, okay? He says, in the law it is written, with other tongues and through the lips of foreigners I will speak to this people, but even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. Tongues then are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers. Prophecy, however, is not for unbelievers, but for believers. So tongues is a sign for unbelievers. Prophecy is a sign for believers. Now this goes back to the other use of tongues, that tongues are often used as a way to communicate the message to someone who otherwise would not get it. Okay, it's a miraculous event in the same way that Pentecost was, that they gave the message and everybody heard in their own language. Now, whether that meant that suddenly the Apostle Matthew could speak in Swahili, I'm kind of, just so you know, I'm on a Swahili kick today, just okay. So just because if the Apostle James was suddenly speaking in Swahili, or the Swahili Jews that were in the audience suddenly could hear and understand in Swahili, you don't know. But the point is, they heard, and the message, the gospel was, and 3,000 were added that day. Okay, so I think it's going back to that approach to tongues. So if the whole church, verse 23, so if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, and inquirers or unbelievers come in, will they not say that you are out of your mind? Well, think about it. If you are a cessationist or if you're just clueless about this, cessationist being a person who believes that the gift of tongues has ceased. If you are, or if you're just clueless about this, and you say, you know what, I'm going to go to that church across the street, and you walk into that church, and everybody is standing up speaking in a language you don't understand, are you going to just, again, for some of us who've been in church our whole life, it's kind of hard to think what the reaction is, but really it's like, okay, what's the likelihood that you're going to come back? If you go to a restaurant and you try to order your food in a restaurant and the person doesn't understand your language, or they start talking to you about the menu and they're giving it to you in Swahili, okay, and you weren't expecting that. I mean, it's a regular restaurant. It's not a Swahili restaurant, if there is such a thing as a Swahili restaurant. East African, because Swahili is like sort of East Africa, I believe. It's a derivative of French. But how likely are you going to go back to that restaurant? It's like, well, no, they don't. I don't understand what they're talking about there. Okay, I don't know. Swahili food might be really good, so maybe you will. But you're going to say, well, no, I'm not going to go back there. And he's like, what kind of a message does it give to the church, to the people in the pews, in the chairs, if this is going on? What are the likelihood that anybody's going to come back? So he says, they're out of your mind. But if an unbeliever or an inquirer comes in while everyone is prophesying, they are convicted of sin and are brought under judgment by all, as the secrets of their hearts are laid bare. So they will all fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you. So, they're not going to, Paul says, listen, if you're speaking in tongues, which is a manifestation of the Spirit, but it's not going to register with non-believers or inquirers. But if you're prophesying and you're giving the truth of God, then that is going to register. So Paul's like, given a choice, leave the tongues at home, use prophecy in the church. Okay, again, Paul doesn't say don't speak in tongues. So you cannot look at this passage and use this as a weapon to say, oh, clearly tongues is no good anymore. Paul does not say that. Paul never says that. Paul never, ever says don't speak in tongues. In fact, near the end, he's going to say don't forbid speaking in tongues. It's a question of whether or when. Or it's a question of where and when. Verse 26, what then shall we say, brothers and sisters, when you come together, each of you has a hymn or word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation? Everything must be done so that the church may be built up. Let me go down here. Tongues is a sign. The purpose of the gathering is to edify believers. Okay? So he lists all these different things that can be done so that the church may be built up. Okay, that's our goal. Whatever we do is to build up the church. It's not to celebrate yourself, it's to build up the church. 2 or 3 prophets, now he's going to move into a topic of, okay, well, what if you do have somebody who's speaking in tongues and you have interpreters there? 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. For you can all prophesy in turn. Okay, play nice, take your turn. That's really what he's saying, okay? What is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. For you can all prophesy in turn so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. Now, this does kind of give you an indication of what services were like back in the day there, okay? Whereas it wasn't a situation necessarily where, so the meetings of this first century church were not necessarily, 3 hymns, an offering, a hymn, and a preacher, okay? And then everybody sat quiet while the preacher preached, and then an invitation, and then you went home. Okay, it was a community thing. Marty stood up, then Silas stood up, then Rebecca stood up, et cetera, okay, and said something, right? And if a revelation comes, for you can all prophesy in turn so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. The spirits of prophets are subject to the control of prophets, for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregation of the Lord's people. Okay, God, and I find this interesting. Paul closes with instructions on order in worship. Here I'm in verses 26 through 40. Everyone should contribute. It all needs to be intelligible. God is a God of order. And I find that interesting. He's reminding them because, that's kind of what Genesis 1 is all about. That, the creation story is really a story of God bringing order out of chaos. Okay? And God is still a God of order. Okay? The next thing where it says P should be the characteristic of the A and just cross that out because I have no idea what I was thinking when I wrote that. I did it, and it was really brilliant. And I printed it, and I went back to fill in mine, and I'm like, okay, what was I thinking there? I have no idea. So I'm just, it's in tongues. I see that's the problem. It's in another language here. Okay. And then he concludes here, where is it? For God is not a God of order, as in all the congregation of the people. And then he comes back with a challenge here in verse 36. Did the word of God originate with you, or are you the only people it has reached? If anyone thinks, okay, guys, did you create this? You're not the first. You're not the first. You're not going to be the last. Okay? Your church is not the first, nor will it be the last. If anyone thinks they are a prophet or otherwise gifted by the Spirit, let them acknowledge that what I am writing to you is the Lord's command. I mean, seriously, if you guys are in tune with what God is saying, you'll understand that this is right. Okay? This is kind of like he who has ears to hear, let him hear, sort of thing. But if anyone ignores this, they will themselves be ignored. Because, if you think about it, this isn't as deep a statement as it is, because what happens when somebody starts talking in a foreign language and you don't hear, how long do you pay careful attention? Not for very long. Once you realize that, hey, this person is not speaking my language. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues. Okay? Do not forbid speaking in tongues. But everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. All right, now some of you are thinking to yourself, wait, didn't you skip something? Isn't there a passage there that you forgot? So does anybody have anything to say before we talk about women keeping silent in the churches, before I lock that one down? Verse 34. For God is not, starting with verse 33, for God is not a God of disorder but of peace, as in all the congregation of the Lord's people. And this is probably how your Bible has it. In verse 34, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. This is every pastor's favorite, one of every pastor's favorite verses here. So what do we do with this? What is Paul talking about here in this particular passage? Do any women want to suggest before I lock it down and this will be the last time you say anything? No, I'm just kidding. Well, there's a couple of preliminary issues here, first of all. One thing is you have to look at the end of verse 33. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. Now, depending on what Bible text you have, some people will look at that as in all congregations of the Lord's people. Is that the end of the first passage, or is that the beginning of the next passage? Now, depending on whether you're a strong, what's called complementarian, or you're a strong believer in what's referred to as patriarchy, the idea that men have a God-given role of leadership and women have a God-given role of submission, and that's, it's important to preserve that. Got to keep that order, got to keep that in line. You're going to look at that passage and you're going to say, that as in all the congregation of the Lord's people is introducing the women need to keep silent in the church. And you can see the difference, because then it's like, if you put it as the introduction to should women keep silent, then clearly it's like, that's a carte blanche. Women keep silent in the church, okay? Or you could look at it and say, no, this is talking about God as a God of order everywhere. Okay, so I'm in that goes at the end of 33. That's the end of 33. That's not the start of 34. Does that make sense? Because the chapters and verse divisions are arbitrary. All right, they are not inspired. The Apostle Paul did not put chapter and verse divisions in here. So we don't know. Okay, the original text is just Greek letters, no punctuation, no breaks. It's just a block of text kind of thing. So, you have to make a decision. Okay, so the first thing is you have to kind of think about where that goes. Okay, and again, different texts will break it up in different ways. And the interesting thing to me about that is that's another way, that we think that when we look at an English Bible, or any Swahili Bible for that matter, that we think, oh yeah, we're just getting the Bible the way God meant it to be. No, somebody decided. Somebody looked at your Bible and said, you know what, that goes at the end of 33. Someone else said, well, that's going to break that verse up and we're going to put that at the start. Okay, somebody made that decision, not God. Somebody made that decision that when they laid out the text, they're doing that. Okay? The other thing you have to think about here is there is a textual problem. Okay, now remember when I talked about Tischendorf here at the start and discovering the Codex Sinaiticus and created the idea of textual criticism. And the idea of textual criticism is comparing what the original text said. So like Paul wrote something. Paul sat down and wrote a letter to the Corinthians. Now how long it took him, and there was a piece of paper, Dear Corinthians, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, love Paul, wrapped it up in an envelope, put a stamp on it, put it in the mail. So there's a piece of paper, vellum, parchment, whatever it was, that had Paul's handwriting. Maybe it had his DNA. Maybe there was a drop from his coffee cup while he was writing it on it that got mailed to the church of Corinth. Okay? That original letter. Okay? That original letter is long gone. We don't know what happened to it. What we do know is that the people of Corinth said, this is such a great letter. There's such great information in this. Or we've got 15 people that need to look at this. Let's make 15 copies of this letter. And so they made 15, and I'm just making up numbers here. They made 15 copies and gave it to the 15 leaders of the church. And the 15 leaders of the church said, I've got 15 leaders of the church, of my own church, that I want. And so they made 15 more copies. And before you know it, there's 225 copies of Paul's letter to the Corinthians floating around there. And I don't know if you've ever done that. Have you ever copied something by hand? I know we're getting out of this. Even typing something. Listen, I can't even type something long enough and remember what I did here. Okay, you can imagine that, okay, a verse gets added, a verse gets subtracted. Or sometimes what would happen is people would write would write a note on the side. Okay, and then somebody would copy it, and it would copy the note on the side. So you'd have the text over here, and then somebody would say, oh, this means this. And then somebody would copy it and put the note on the side, this means this. And somebody else would copy it and say, you know what, let's just put that this means this in here in the middle of the text. And so the next person who gets it doesn't realize that the this means this came out of the text. So I said all that to say this. And if you have a modern study Bible, we'll take note of it, that there are some verses or some versions of the Bible, I shouldn't say some versions of the Bible, some manuscript groups where this passage, 34 and 35, come after verse 40. Okay, now, the thing is, these verses are in every manuscript. There is no manuscript where these verses do not exist. It isn't like the ending of Mark, the long ending of Mark, where there are manuscripts where they don't exist. Okay? There are, or John 8. There are no manuscripts, there are manuscripts where those don't exist. There are, it's in some manuscripts at the end of chapter 40, or verse 40, some it comes after verse 33. Okay? The thing is, that is an anomaly. That is very unusual. Okay? It also suggests that, the copiers were like going, oh yeah, we can move this around. Okay? But some suggest that is so unusual. There's only like one other, it's like the largest verse where that has happened. I mean, there's one manuscript group where two of the Beatitudes are switched. But they just kind of came in, but no other text is this significantly moved in the text, which means somebody is making an editorial choice about where this particular thing best fits. And you have to ask yourself, why is somebody making that decision? Well, because it's clearly something that was added. Okay, now, the argument is that, but it's in every text. And so the fact that it's in a couple of others isn't as strong as you can think. So Gordon Fee, who wrote the commentary, goes very strong on this was not written by Paul.
Those two verses?
Yeah. Gordon Fee. So, and again, I've a great deal of respect for Gordon Fee. He says that those weren't written by Paul. Okay? Others, like D.A. Carson, who I also respect, wrote an entire article dealing with just simply Gordon Fee's belief of this. Why it doesn't believe that. Why this is not, D.A. Carson calls it a first-rate mind defending a weak position, is how D.A. Carson called it. But you know what? I'm like, this, here's the problem. Well, let me make sure I've got here. There's a textual problem. Okay? You have some issues if you want to accept the verse. So let me go back here. So what do we do with these verses? So there's a couple of things. There's several different things you can do with them. It's how do we use them? How do we take these and say, okay, how does this make sense for the church in 2024? Okay? Well, the first thing you do, one way, how do we deal with these verses? Well, women, you need to keep silent in the church. That's easy enough. Okay? That's the easiest thing to do. Okay? And there are people that would stick with that. Okay? Debbie and I went to a church once when we were just, it was actually fairly early in our relationship. We went to a church that was going through a pastoral transition, and there was a question and answer time of this incoming pastor where the congregation could ask the pastor to be questions. And I believe we're going to do that with whatever, right? Isn't that part of the plan? I don't know if there is or not. But so in the course of this conversation, of this, and it was a mixed group. It was just the body of the church. So, the Sunday night body of the church was there, and they were asking questions. And we were just there because we were thinking of this was a church that was kind of, comfort church for us, our people, sort of thing. So this guy came in, and the question came up about women speaking in the church. And in the course of that, answering that question, or however it come, this guy made it very clear. This pastor made it very clear that he was not going to entertain questions from women in business meetings and the like. Okay? And there was a woman in front of us and he said, using this verse, he said they should go home and ask their husbands. And there was a woman in front of us who said, well, again, raised her hand because she realized this might be the last chance he was ever going to call on her. She said, what about me? I'm a widow. Okay. And his reply, as I recall, and Debbie and I were kind of, because it's fading into the nether world of my memory. His reply was, well, you need to talk to the pastor privately, kind of thing. That he just wasn't going to entertain women. I know of another church where they have church business meetings, where everybody gets to vote. Men and women get to vote, and big issues are discussed. But prior to the business meeting, they have a men's meeting. And it's at the men's meeting where the decision is actually made, and then they go to the business meeting where everybody gets to vote. Okay, so it's like, the issues are discussed at the men's meeting, and then it's at the business meeting that things are taken care of. So the easiest way is to say, let the women keep silent in the church. Okay, well, there's a problem with that. Okay, there's a problem with that on a number of levels, especially if you think about what was the church in this day. Okay, what was the church in this day? It wasn't what we see here. It wasn't this. Okay, they were meeting in church. They were meeting in houses. They were meeting in, and what does the Bible say? Where two or three are gathered together in my name. So it's like, okay, is that realistic? Is Paul giving a realistic statement even in the first century? Was that realistic to think that the women, every time the church was assembled, which is any time two or three are gathered together, that the women are going to be quiet? Okay, and I mean no disrespect to women. Is that realistic? Is it realistic that you're going to take any group, any identifiable group, and say, okay, this particular group of individuals, whenever the church is together, you need to be quiet? Is that realistic? Okay, so again, I'm not buying it. That it's realistic, okay? But there's a problem there. There's another problem we'll get down to in a minute. But the second thing, okay, so you could just say Paul did not write it. Okay, and this is Gordon Fee's position to say this is it was added by somebody who said, you know what, we really need to keep the male control about it. Even though Paul, again, identifies that the Christian community is supposed to be a radically different community. And in Galatians 3, he gives the banner thing. There is no Jew nor Gentile. There is no slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. Whatever these distinctions are gone in Christianity. That the Christian community is supposed to be a radically different community. And somebody early on said, whoa, let's just back that bus up a little bit. I guess you back the chariot up a little bit. I said, we got to put an end to that. Let's just throw in a passage about let the women keep silent in the church. Okay? That's Fee's position. Okay? So they say, some say that it's just a quotation that he's quoting the Corinthian church, which he has done before, that he's quoting the Corinthian church, and he says, and his reply, did the word of God originate with you? It's an odd discussion. So here I say it's either a quotation. Paul did not write them. It's either a quotation, that's what the Q word is, or the G word is gloss, Gloss. A gloss. A gloss refers to something that was possibly written on the side and later added in. Okay? It could be somebody, maybe the first person who wrote this. This is the argument. Maybe the first person who wrote this looked at it or copied it and looked at it and said, "Oh, no. We can't have that. Okay? We need to throw in a little thing that kind of, we don't want people to get out of line here." Maybe the pastor, the main pastor, the first one who got the letter, because somebody opened it first and said, "Wait, we need to add this in. I'm going to make a copy of this and destroy the original." Okay? I mean, again, it's a situation of where, when you get somebody, you're telling somebody what somebody else said, and this person doesn't understand it, and you think, well, I think what he's trying to say is this. And you end up explaining what you think the person was trying to say, or what the person would have said if they had had that question. Okay? The next thing you have to, in dealing with this verse, is you do have another problem, and that if you remember back to chapter 11, and they made a big deal out of it at the time, when we talked about head coverings, Paul had a problem with women praying or prophesying in the church with their head not covered. And at that point, Paul could have said, if he in fact wanted women to be quiet, he could have just said, the women shouldn't be talking at all. But he doesn't. He just says, they need to do this. Do what? Pray or prophesy in the church with their head covered. So if you say, no, Paul is clearly saying that women need to keep silent, well, then you got a contradiction on your hands. Call it whatever you want. I mean, to me, it's like Paul says women need to keep silent, and here Paul says they need to, when they're praying and prophesying, they need to have cover. Now, again, no matter how you look at this particular passage, that you've got to, I don't care what position you take. Because if you say, oh, no, women need to keep silent in the churches. Okay, well, what about praying and prophesying with your head covered? Oh, well, okay, that's a different example of a different, you're going to do this with any particular passage, any way you take this particular verse. So you could just say Paul is just contradicting himself. Okay? So if you have a very strong view of inerrancy, then you got a real problem there. Okay? Or a fourth thing you could do is Paul is dealing with a very specific problem at Corinth. And the very specific problem he's dealing with in Corinth, he's talking about tongues. He's talking about the interpretation of tongues. He's talking about people giving a message in tongues and somebody standing up afterwards interpreting what's being said. And so apparently what's happening, and again, you speculate because we don't exactly know, but apparently what's happening is man is standing up, giving a message in tongues. He's saying something, and again, the way it's being exercised, the person doesn't know what he's saying. And then the wife is getting up and saying, here's what he says. So the wife is standing up and explaining to the husband, to the church, what the husband just said. So the wife is speaking for the husband, or telling the husband this, or telling the church, this is what the Lord is saying through my husband. Okay? And you can imagine how much fun that could be. All right? Because now why am I dealing with husband and wife? Okay, listen to the verses. Verse 33, women should keep silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law. If they want to inquire, they should ask their own husbands. So what women are we talking about? Married women. Because otherwise there's nobody to ask. Okay, so it's dealing with a very specific problem of speaking in tongues, which Paul says don't do if you can't interpret it. And he says, and you shouldn't have wives standing up interpreting what their husband says. Because, there is a tone of patriarchalism to it there. Okay, I personally am torn between, I never really went strong on the gloss part of it until I read Fees. Again, Gordon Fees, the one who's writing the commentary. I did not go big on the gloss part until I read, and I did read D.A. Carson's whole article on why Gordon Fee is wrong. Okay. So it's not like I didn't give attention to the other side, but I am less convinced, or let's put it this way, it's that, the hard inerrancy thing just kind of gets you in trouble. I'm not as hard in inerrantist as I used to be, kind of thing. It's like, okay, I think there's a problem with this particular verse. So I think either it's a gloss. This is my opinion, and there are people in this church who would disagree quite vehemently with me. Maybe even Debbie, but she can't. She was not going to stand up and say here that she does. That's interesting. So if any women disagree with me, then you're not going to say, so I can't lose here, right? But that it's either a gloss or he's dealing with a very specific problem in the church at Corinth that may happen in any church today, but as a general rule, this verse only applies if you're dealing with a church meeting where you've got people speaking in tongues in an unknown language, and the only person to interpret is the wife. That to me is what Paul is talking about in this verse. And I think if you use this verse, if anybody uses this verse as an excuse for saying, oh no, we do not, as a support to patriarchy or anything like that, I think you've gone beyond the text. That's again, like I said, not everybody here at this church would agree with me. Maybe not everybody in this room agrees with me. But that's where I see this particular verse. I think Paul envisions the church being a radical community that upends society and just maintaining the patriarchal structure was just one of dozens and dozens of other things that Paul says, no, Christianity is beyond that. It's a radical community that is people are supposed to go, whoa. And if it looks just like the world's, social structure, what's the difference? Kind of thing. So, all right, I'm sorry. I kept telling Debbie that, the fireworks came at the end of this one. So we needed to rattle through everything. Any questions? This will be interesting. So if any woman asks, I know you agree with me. So, no.
No, it's helpful to talk through this, it really is.
Is there really a problem with inerrancy if you take it in the context of this is just dealing with a specific?
Not to me.
Well,
Not to me. But it's like, again, I'm like,
The original manuscript, you can still say that was inerrant. It's just we don't have that.
right.
never have. I mean, and so the question is, what did the original manuscript say? Was it in the original manuscript, and if so, where? So if it comes after verse 40, so and again, that's a minority view. The idea that it's a gloss, that's a minority view. Actually, Carson points out that it's a liberal view, which used to be like the kiss of death, to just be called that's a liberal view, which is not nearly the pejorative to me that it used to be. Sometimes like a liberal, yeah, I don't know if that's that bad, kind of thing. So any questions? Again, it's almost 10:15, so I'm sorry for keeping you later. So, all right, next week, 1 Corinthians 15.
Yep.